What I want to talk about today, maybe indirectly in reference to the debates that you're all having as well about, when's journalism education, where does it belong, where is it going to, what should we teach, what shouldn't we teach, what does the degree actually mean, given the precarious condition of the industry, or should I say industries, where our students end up in. I want to talk to you about a project that I've just finished with a colleague called Beyond Journalism. It looks at emerging forms of journalism or things that people themselves call journalism all around the world, but that wouldn't qualify necessarily as journalism given the rather restricted definitions that we tend to use in our field. So a lot of startups, we've been all over the world, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll try to drag in some of the other work that I've had a chance of doing on looking at the changing, the evolving nature of the news and other media industries, and how that, in my mind, impacts what we talk about when we talk about journalism. Before I move on, I need to give a quick shout out to my colleague Tamara Witskus. Some of you may know her. She previously was a professor of journalism at Goldsmith and at Cardiff University. She came back to the Netherlands a couple of years ago, around the same time that I came back from working in the US. I worked at Indiana University together with my wonderful colleague Mike Conway, who's here today. Hey Mike, from Indiana. And we started this Beyond Journalism project together. It's a book that will come out next year with Quality Press, and we've got to get down to writing it. So, journalism, right? And the thing that got us started, Tamara and I, and got my work started some time ago, probably like many of you, I came from the profession of journalism before I entered into academia, reluctantly, but nonetheless so. That what we think of when we think of journalism, when we theorize about journalism, when we talk about journalism in class, when we mention the word journalism, what we're actually always referred to is this, is sort of the old newsroom. Because that's where these definitions and ideas of journalism took shape, took form, right? The debate started there, then it got sort of set in stone by us in our handbooks, in our teaching manuals, in our discourse. And when we now talk about professional routines and role perceptions, even functions of journalism, and when we use lofty terms like public sphere and watchdog, what we're really referring back to is how journalists among themselves, white men, how they made sense of what they were doing 150 years ago, and or throughout that particular history. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. This is not different from any other field, for that matter. Even think about medicine. But still, this is sort of the setting the stage of what we talk about now. But sometimes we, or let me just make it about myself, I forget this. And I have lovely, great debates about journalism, and journalism should do this and should do that, and journalists should do more of this and less of that. But I keep forgetting that what I'm really talking about is that. That, of course, doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there's still newsrooms, but I'm sure many of you go to newsrooms regularly. And this is the big sort of, I would say, illusion. They still look like this. They're still predominantly white guys walking around there. They still have desks, maybe instead of typewriters, computers. It kind of looks and smells and feels fairly similar. And when you go into a newsroom in Helsinki or in Amsterdam or here on Fleet Street or in the US where Mike and I worked, or in Brazil or in China, I'll show you some pictures from newsrooms in China where I've just been. They all look pretty much the same. The difference is Chinese newsrooms have plants everywhere. It's beautiful. So it seems like, yeah, the newsroom is still there, journalism is still doing its thing, the debate is still going on. Great. Well, not really. And that's sort of where my discussion starts about what is happening to journalism, how is it changing, how does that impact the way we make sense of it, the way we teach it. 2 years ago, this report came out, much discussed and debated, the report especially in the US, but I think internationally as well, by the Town Center called Post-Industrial Journalism, where Lee Shirky and Chris Anderson and Emily Bell wrote what they they saw is how journalism was changing. And I want to share the key quote, I think, with you. What they say is that the journalism industry is dead, but journalism exists in many places, which is an interesting statement, right? I mean, this was that industry. This is that. Not that in the sense, and not just that because it doesn't earn, it still earns quite a lot of money actually, but, and it still gets a lot of attention. I mean, I'm opening my speech with front pages of newspapers. But it is dead in all kinds of other ways. Primarily, I would argue, because this is not where the discussion of what journalism is takes place anymore. And so there's an entirely new discussion emerging that sort of moves through these newsrooms and exists in all kinds of other places. And the best thing to describe that journalism is that it's not journalism, but journalisms. Many different kinds of journalism. And how do we deal with that? Do we cordon off journalism? Say, look, yes, there's stuff happening outside the newsroom. There's journalists working on their own. There's editorial collectives. There's startups. There's all kinds of journalism taking place. Like banks have their own magazines, and shops have their own radio stations with local news and whatever. And like, yes, there's journalism happening, but that's not real journalism. The real journalism is still happening inside that newsroom, and that's what we're going to focus on. That's one way of dealing with this. I would say that's what 80 to 90% of all scholarship does. Let's do another content analysis of The Guardian and the New York Times. Right? Like that means anything. Of course it means a lot. It means primarily that we're telling to each other, this is still what journalism is. And the rest is just, it doesn't really exist. Or we can say, no, we're going to look at all the new stuff. And then, so you see one journal after the next doing special issues, even entire journals. Digital journalism is one of those journals that just does nothing else but study the new. And equating technology and online with the new. So whatever happens online, whatever journalist or freelancer or startup is now doing with Snapchat or with Kik or with any of these kind of cool new platforms, that is sort of heralded as, it's very exciting, it's the pioneer, that's where new stuff is happening, that's great, that's awesome, it's cool. And I've made myself guilty of that enterprise as well in the past. Our argument is, well, both of these discussions are important, and we have to find a way to theorize and then, of course, translate it to practice and education, then in an integrated way. So that was the goal that we set ourselves for Beyond Journalism. A first instance of this project is a website that I would warmly recommend you as fellow educators. It's a website called multiplejournalism.org. It's a site that was set up by a couple of Dutch investigative reporters and documentary filmmakers. My university, and specifically our graduate program in journalism, got involved. What it is, it's an ongoing database with journalistic reports on forms of journalism around the world that are sort of combining old ways of doing things and values with new ways, using technologies in interesting ways, deploying networks or doing community or civic journalism or anything that is sort of interesting and doesn't fit with any real definition, any traditional definition of journalism. And some of the stuff on this website is from mainstream traditional legacy media. A lot of it is from, a couple of community bloggers in Tanzania that set up a sort of a crowdsourced news sharing service in their community. Or a platform in Berlin that enables street-level grassroots journalism in Brazil to be published for free. And so things like that. And we set up this website to both inspire journalists, but especially journalism students. Right, to give also educators something else to work with as an example in class, instead of just the last story in the New York Times or this great report in The Guardian or something on BBC. With all due respect. So that was the first step, just a fairly straightforward sort of database that we're still working on, and anybody in the world can submit stories to this database too. This is not something that we do, we've set it up, created the platform, and it's open, it can be used for classes, for example, to have students do a report and then have it published on this website. It's all for free, and it's managed by a couple of editors in Amsterdam. And instead of the image that I want you to take with you as I go into this talk, is not so much the image of the white guys in the newsroom, But
stop talking about white guys, you know. There are newsrooms in India, in Africa.
I will get to those.
It's not necessary to keep talking about white guys.
I'm a white guy. I'll do that, and I'll get to those newsrooms as well. To stop thinking about, respectfully, the traditional representations of newsrooms, and start thinking about, well, in this case, the metaphor that I want to give you is not so much a young woman, but a DJ, a disc jockey. As a sort of a metaphor of a professional identity of journalists and journalism that seems to be adapting itself most successfully to this emerging discussion about what journalism is or could be, and I'll get to it in a bit more detail later, but I wanted you to sort of like take the image of the traditional newsroom away and replace it with this person who's somehow mixing his or her way into this new field. I'll get to that later. Quick shout out, the title of the book and the project is Beyond Journalism. This term we took from Nietzsche's, when Nietzsche was first translated into English, and his book on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. His concept of the Übermensch, that we all know, of course, was translated not as Superman, as it was translated in the 70s and 80s, but in the 20s it was translated as Beyond Man, as a human being that is somehow capable to move beyond itself, him or herself. And what did Nietzsche mean at the time? I mean, somebody who is able to sort of unshackle himself from everything that keeps him or her down, which at the time he primarily associated with religion, and with anything that kept him or her from being truly free. And we found that an inspiring idea. So, because journalism, to some extent, or journalists to some extent, are kept shackled in a certain way, mostly by us and by themselves, to keep framing the discussion about what journalism is or should be in those terms of those newsrooms discussions that have been evolving for the last 150 years. So what happens when we insert those discussions with new ingredients, taken from all the other places where journalism is now taking shape? Can we set journalism free? And while maintaining, of course, our professional standards of quality and what we expect of them in a functioning democracy. So that's kind of the intellectual grounding, if you will. I'll look at how journalism is going beyond itself and what the key developments in my mind are on these four levels of the media environment that we're living in, that we're working in. First, the first level, the media system, right? How is the media system organized? What does it look like? What are the key general trends? Then the media institutions, the businesses, the companies, the places where journalism takes shape. Then what is happening in terms of production routines? How are stories being told? What do journalists actually do? Like the previous panel rightfully said, let's acknowledge and recognize what journalists are doing, celebrate it as well for the fact that under incredibly precarious conditions, they still turn out amazing product every day. And finally, who are these media professionals that are still doing journalism, still show up for work, if that work exists and if it's even paid, right? I mean, what kind of people are these? What kind of skills, what kind of values, what kind of affect do they have about their job? And I'll get back to that later as well. So first, the media system. And of course, for years, we've now tracked on a global scale, this is a slide from the US, but you know the story on a global scale that, you know, the media industry is homogenizing and converging, right? Big companies get bigger, take stakes in each other. There are fewer and fewer diverse players on most national and international markets. And within these companies, there are increasing alliances with all kinds of other companies that generally can be traced back to only 3 or 4 massive new media giants, right? Yahoo, Microsoft, AOL, and Google, primarily, of course, Microsoft and Google, are the key players behind the scenes that we rely on. You can add Facebook to this mix as well, that we rely on for our media companies, not just journalism, mind you, but also film, television, advertising, to function, to get the message across. And we sometimes forget that that's running behind the scenes. There's actually an even more important type of systematic media system convergence going on that I'm afraid almost none of us, and with us I mean us scholars of the industry, pay any attention to. And that is this. computing and computing platforms and software. And that software is pretty much produced by only a handful of companies worldwide. And I've studied, I remember in the late 1990s, I studied the rise of indie media. I really sure I still remember that. Those were these sort of cool alternative independent media centers sort of coming up in the wake of protests against the World Trade Organization in 1999 in Seattle. A movie was made of that, with Charlize Theron in it, great movie. At the time I was really excited on what kind of people are doing this kind of street level grassroots journalism and what are they doing. And the big thing that I learned from studying these editorial collectives in different parts of the world was that, well, yes, there were people in the streets reporting on protests and grassroots and activism and all that kind of stuff, but what was really happening was a bunch of techies were running everything. They couldn't do anything without the tech people, who also did this voluntarily, generally speaking, approved it or made it possible through their content management, their coding, their programming. And often this went really well, but more often than not, this went horribly, horribly wrong. In the sense that they couldn't do the kind of journalism that they wanted to, because technologically it wasn't possible, or the tech people were on a break, or they just didn't feel like it, or they thought it messed with their beautiful, pristine system that they just built, or any of that. And it's a small type of story that I want to make a bit bigger, is that we sometimes forget the materiality of journalism. So the media system, yes, it has convergence, and it has sort of the increased integration of these companies, ownership structures, there's an homogenization process going on. The work of Paolo Ruskowski is crucial, I think, in this context. But underneath it all, there's an even greater convergence going on among the companies and the service providers that make everything run. And as we should know, and we should probably know, is that none of these systems are neutral. Right? Technology, software, computing systems, content management systems, cameras, microphones, I mean, none of this is value neutral. There are assumptions about who people are, what you can do with it, what kind of stories you can tell, in what way, in what sequence, are built in the design of these systems. And we love to think of journalists being able to tell a story and we explain them how, and then, you know, inverted pyramid and all that kind of stuff. But we sometimes forget that a lot of these stories are, and a lot of these formats are produced by technology, not by values and not by people, and certainly not by people who think of themselves as perhaps even creative storytellers, but by technology. So I was very happy that last year Seth Lewis and Oscar Wetland produced a paper in digital journalism calling for journalism studies to acknowledge, to better conceptualize the changing nature of human actors, non-human technological actants, and diverse representations of audiences, especially the interaction between these three. There was just an AJE Conference in Japan where this paper got the prize for the best journal article of last year, and I think that's absolutely valid, because it's kind of a dimension of news work that we sometimes forget. And in our project, we study this by, for example, looking at, when we look in, for example, go to startups, taking pictures of and checking what kind of software are people running, how are they using it, what are their reflections on the technologies that they use. Are these technologies open source, or are they somehow commercial? How are journalists in negotiation with these technologies? Because these technologies shape very much the kind of stories that we can tell. Of course, that both creates amazing storytelling, and I'll give you some examples later that you probably already know much better than I do. But they also restrict, constrain in interesting ways. And this is not the constraint that we theorize, like the constraint of advertising or corporate pressure or editorial guidelines. It's the constraint of the machines that we're using. And I think that's the real constraint. The other constraints are often, as the research also shows, imaginary. Right? It's not that Rupert Murdoch looks at your typeboard as you're typing a story when you work for News Corp. It's just that you assume that he does, and that's how you censor yourself. That's generally what journalists who work for these kind of companies say in research. But the technology is much, in that sense, more real, and it's directly influencing what you're doing. How well do we know our own technologies? Related to this, a specific aspect of this, which I think is very interesting, and I just want to share an anecdote with you, is what some would call the algorithmic turn in media industries. More and more media industries rely on algorithms for two things. One is to predict what people want, and the other is to create the kind of content that fits that demand. So technology is a content predictor and a demand and a content creator. To give you an example, Netflix is a perfect example, right? Netflix produces television shows like House of Cards, and those television shows are generated by algorithms, right? The algorithm that is based on the data from what people watch over time online, and then you can get fine-tuned profiles of what most people in a certain demographic would love to watch. They want to watch something that has politics and crime and Kevin Spacey and blah, blah, blah. You throw it all together and you get House of Cards. Yes, House of Cards is a remake of an original series, but it was an algorithm that produced this. And that is, Amazon works the same way now. Actually, most big media companies, this is how they think of new series, new programs. So an algorithm as a demand predictor. And you see similar things happening in newsrooms. A very popular piece of software that is now finding its way to quite a few media companies is called Chartbeat. And Chartbeat is a little desktop application that floats on your computer. And what it does in real time, it shows you how many people are where on the website, where did they came from, how much time did they spend on any article, did they scroll, what are they looking at, and it's produced in real time. So there's one, the main quality national newspaper in the Netherlands, NRC, when they introduced it, journalists were up in arms. Like, I don't want to know this stuff, this distracts from my work. Within 3 months, the whole thing changed and now it's a big internal competition. Like who's on top? Who's below, and they're also kind of like sniggering because some of the most senior, like famous political journalists, apparently nobody reads them online, and they're all like, but and then every week there's an email from the editor-in-chief sort of summarizing the statistics and saying, good job those people, bad job those people, and it's kind of creepy. it's at least that's what journalists tell me. But then there's also algorithms that produce journalism. Some of you may have heard of companies like Automatic Insights or Narratively. Those are companies that write software that write news. And the LA Times, for example, uses this kind of software to generate reports on sports and the economy. And so a piece of software writes the article. This is the logo of a company that we've studied in our project. It's a company called Inca Vinca. They're based just outside of LA. It's a small startup with 3 people, a CEO, sort of a super flashy guy who loves aeroplanes and is a multimillionaire. Then it's a CFO, somebody who brings in money, and then there's a programmer. And what do? They write software that if you give them a sort of, I want to know everything about Brexit. And the software will generate a video report of 3 minutes summarizing everything you need to know about Brexit, customized to you. And their goal is to write software that will, and where do they get the information from? Online. They just pull it from every available source, video source, and so the software must be pretty sophisticated because it has to integrate words, links, video, images, tag everything, you give it metadata, feed it through an algorithm, so whatever you ask of it, it can produce a valid journalistic report. Now, why does Inca Vinca do this? Because they want to sell the technology to Google, or Apple, or any of these big giants. They got an offer for $50 million and they turned it down because they think they can get more money out of this. Three people. They don't care about journalism at all, but they make something that's pretty remarkable if you check it out. I want to share a personal anecdote. Just recently, I was in China to prove it. That's me. This is the Yangcheng Evening News. It's one of the 5th largest newspaper in the world. It's based in Guangzhou in China, which is quite close to Hong Kong, but this is mainland China. And these journalists were kind enough to sort of show me around. As you can see, there's plants everywhere. And there's little plants on every desk, 4 of them exactly on the corners. Very nice. And this is a room in the center of the newsroom. And they were very proud in showing me this room. And so, this is sort of where the editors come together, they make decisions about the newspaper of the day. It was also the first newspaper in China that had its standalone tablet app. So, where people access the newspaper on an iPad, for example. So as you can see, there's this massive video wall in the back, and there's these colored dots. And I didn't take video because I had to be kind of like this, but these dots were moving. So I asked them, so what's going on? And they said, oh yes, glad that you asked. This is a real-time rendering of debates on social media in China. And they're color-coded for theme and topic. So for example, blue is the economy, green is, let's say, the environment, red is smog alerts in Beijing, or like that kind of stuff. White is, so every color has a certain topic and theme, and so this enables the journalists, they would tell me, to see in real time what people in China, and don't forget, I mean, half of the Chinese population is online and active on WeChat and those kind of apps. And that's, all that data is drawn into the newsroom in real time and visualized. And the idea behind this is that journalists, when they check in to work, would walk past the video wall, see what most people are talking about, and then write stories about that topic. Because those stories would then float to the top of the website, and the next day would be on the front page of the newspaper. Journalists would still do their own reporting and all that kind of stuff, but it would be sort of based on what most people in China, and especially of course in the region, were talking about. So I thought it was an interesting interaction between technology as both a demand predictor and a content creator, even though the technology itself didn't create the content, the journalists were encouraged. Now, why would journalists even do this? Well, I don't know if you know how journalists get paid in China. They get a base salary which is not enough to pay the rent. It's almost nothing. Let's say it's about 600 euros a month. On top of that, they earn money by an algorithm. The algorithm is a combination of a rating that they get from their direct supervisor, the number of stories per day that they file, the topics of these stories. Certain topics are rated higher than others. The number of people that click on these stories online, and where in the newspaper they eventually end up, whether on the 1 or the 3 or the 5 or any of the other pages. So there's an algorithm that, and some of them, I talked to one journalist, he has a monthly income of almost 3,000 euros, and the other one 750, because he just had a little baby. But I wouldn't be surprised to see that system migrating to our part of the world at some point. Final note on this anecdote that I thought was interesting was at some point the presentation was over and the video will change to these screens. And I don't know if you, so some of these screens are your typical desktops, nothing much going on. But here, somebody is selecting a piece of text and typing. And I saw it in real time. And I said, what's this? He said, oh yeah, those are the screens of all the journalists in the newsroom. What? I said, yeah, so we can see who's working on what. Workplace surveillance, that's also a really good thing. I mean, Fairfax Media in Australia reported on this, that they do workplace surveillance a couple of years ago in newsrooms, so that's a fun role of technology as well. Anyway, media institutions. We all know that kind of the structure of media industries is generally the same around the world. And it has this shape of an hourglass, where there's a handful of big companies on one end, and then lots and lots of tiny little companies on the other hand that aren't very many medium-sized companies. And with size, I mean the number of people working there. So you got your Viacoms and those kind of companies with tens of thousands of people around the world, and then you've got, you know, a local newspaper somewhere or a local publisher owning a couple of newspapers with newsrooms between 50 and 100 people on the bottom, or startups that are even smaller. What is key, I guess, to this structure, when we look at it from the perspective of journalists, is that there's an increased dynamism in the structure. Like people and companies move through this hourglass at accelerating speeds, which is there is no one way of looking at the media institution anymore. I would say it's a much more dynamic system. I mean, and methodologically, how do you study a system that's moving very fast? What I find really interesting as a sort of a backdrop to the increased dynamism is when it comes specifically to journalism, to the journalism industry on a worldwide level, is something that on the one that Toby Miller described a couple of years ago as a new international division of cultural labor. What that means is that journalists around the world, whether they're employed by a company or whether they're independent or freelance or one way or another, are increasingly sucked up, one way or another, in a global media institution, where these media are one way or another interconnected, and everybody one way or another is interrelated or linked. I'll give you an example of how that works. For example, Reuters and AP are the biggest news brands on the planet, right? Most of the international news, most of the news worldwide is generated by these two companies. Now, these two companies used to have a massive network of journalists working for them. Not anymore. But what they do is hire an increasingly dense network of stringers, handlers, correspondents, freelancers, all around the world that provide them with news. I mean, the Dutch media industry is a good example. They've all fired their foreign correspondents, but there are more foreign correspondents working for Dutch media than ever before in history. None of them employed, of course, by any of the media companies. I mean, we've seen horrific images of journalists being beheaded, right, in the Middle East. Did anybody notice that all of them are freelance? Every single one of them? There's no full-time reporters there anymore. Some, but they stay in their hotels, wisely. And some of them are from here that go there without insurance, because no insurance company will take insurance out of them, or when they do, you can't afford it as a freelancer. Without any network or support structure, and go there to report. Most of these journalists are, of course, local, temporarily hired in to provide stories. So that's one way of us being drawn into this global system of journalism and journalistic work. Some people call this remote control journalism, right? That most of the news that we get is sort of journalism by remote control. We control journalists somewhere elsewhere on the planet without actually having any responsibility for them as an institution. And the same thing is happening on an extreme local level. And the lowdown is one of many, this is an American example, we got them all over the world, of so-called hyper-local online news sites. And often community blogs started by somebody in their basement or in their bedroom reporting on what's happening on a street corner. I just attended a PhD defense yesterday in Amsterdam of a student, well not a student, a fresh young doctor now, who did a study of all the 132 hyperlocal news operations in the Netherlands. And he said, yes, I mean, many of them pop up and disappear a year later. Many of them are kind of amateurish and all of them. But the ones who stick with it earn massive amounts of money. And he says, I mean, clearly, local news is a gold mine. It's just that no traditional media institution has found a way to do it. Still not after all these years. So journalism in that sense, and this speaks to this dynamism, right? It's like both getting very abstract, like, okay, we're having this worldwide network of journalists, remote control journalism, and it's extremely local and right around the corner, and it's both. Sociologically, it makes sense that these two developments happen at the same time, of course, but they speak to how journalism is sort of dispersing, becoming more of a network, harder to maybe, can you define what's happening here with the same terms and concepts and models as what's happening there? Interesting. Our aim is, yes, we should be able to, because it's all journalism's perhaps. What's happening in the level of media production? Well, I saw in the previous presentation there was some slides on, based on an interview with students. And I would venture a hypothesis is that if you ask students in any journalism program anywhere in the world, their number one reason for going into journalism, generally I would say that their answers can be summarized as, I want to tell a story. That can be motivated by, I want to interview my favorite athlete, or I want to bring the government down, or I want to expose corruption, I want to be a watchdog, I want to just hang out with cool people, white guys or not, but I want to tell stories. The interesting thing, of course, that's exactly the same motivation for people who are going into advertising, film, television, video games, or the music industry. But for journalism students, this is key. When they complain to us, they complain that they don't get enough classes in writing and making things. So content. Content is what drives journalism and this industry and the motivation of people in it. The interesting thing is, though, is to ask ourselves, what is actually happening to content in our industry? Is content still something that a journalist makes? I would say over 50% of the work in the industry has nothing to do with making your own content anymore, or at least not in the way that we think of when we enter into a journalism program. So content is first of all global, which means that content is produced from anywhere, can come from anywhere, can be part of your news organization and content from anywhere. So in that sense, and not just from other organizations, but just from anybody online, your story as a hardworking journalist that goes up on the website of your employer or the person who paid you is competing with anybody's Instagram update, anywhere. And I'm not saying these things are equal in weight and value, of course not. But the point is that your content is, in that sense, in the digital realm, just as valuable, just as meaningful as any other content. Beyond the fact that, of course, you're competing with content that is going internationally. I mean, one of the most successful journalism startups in the Netherlands is a company called 360 Magazine. It operates in many different countries, also in France, for example. And what they do is they summarize interesting news stories from around the world into Dutch and then sell it again. And they only have hired a bunch of journalists who act as translators. Content goes global. Content is increasingly a la carte, right, based on algorithmic demand prediction. Like, well, you need to, as a newspaper in Chile that has changed its policy that whatever people clicked on the most the day after, in the evening, journalists write stories about it and that will be the front page of the next day. So journalists just wait to see what people are talking about. A bit like what's happening in China. Content, about content, I mean, as we all know, massive journalism today is trying to get people to pay attention to our work. And that generally means that we have to somehow get people interested about stories that we've already made. I was visiting another national newspaper in the Netherlands recently, and was talking with the editor-in-chief. And I said, so what is your biggest challenge in your company at this moment? And I was talking to him as a new professor of a journalism program in Amsterdam. I wanted to get sort of, are we teaching the right things to our kids? And it was really beautiful. He sighed, he did this wave and glass windows, right? It's a hip office, so he saw all the people working on a desk, a couple of them. And he says, you know, these people. I said, okay, what's the challenge with these people? He said, like, I have to somehow convince them that they should stop coming into work, file their report, and go home. I can't, there's no way of running a media company now. They have to, the moment they start working on a story, have to start pitching it. First, of course, within the newsroom, but then, of course, to their audiences and their constituencies, their communities. Then upload parts of the story, maybe to do a quick headline on Twitter, and then maybe something on a running news feed. Then, of course, maybe get some pictures, get some video. Then maybe the story gets uploaded, and then promote that story on his or her own Twitter feed, Instagram, and all that kind of stuff. Then, when that is done, then see if there's follow-ups to be made after people's responses or response from people in the story. Then develop an expertise around that story, then take that expertise on the road, organize panel debates, give workshops, talks in the country, go out into the streets. And so, in other words, become some kind of a company yourself. And most of that is produce content about the content that you originally created. Of course, a lot of journalism is for free, even though somebody still expects to be paid for it. That's an interesting dilemma. Content is everywhere. I mean, let's say you're excellent at writing stories for newspapers. Oops, nobody's loyal to newspapers anymore. Some people still are. That's wonderful. But generally, the behavior of the average media consumer is disloyal. People consume more media today than ever before in history, but not on any low basis of loyalty. They take whatever they can get on whatever device, wherever they get some Wi-Fi or whatever connection they can get, they'll take it. And of course, we all know that every story looks and acts and smells and behaves differently on different platforms. Again, with different technologies, framing, constraining, and producing that story before you even started typing or shooting or filming or editing. And of course, like I said earlier, content is increasingly produced by journalists, but by users. Much was made a couple of years ago when several American newspapers started calling their journalists content managers instead of journalists. And part of your job is to manage the content produced outside of the organization, primarily by users, for free. The most successful startup in France is called Mediapart. It started by the former editors-in-chief of Le Monde and Le Figaro, very high-quality professional journalists. One of the main reasons why they're so successful is that blogs of users appear on the front page next to investigative reports by hardworking journalists. They're interchangeable. You cannot see the difference. So it's a truly democratic platform. It's actually a really great website, very old school. But it's interesting that your story is that you work for, that you expect to be paid for, competes with a story that was made for free. Yeah, this is
check it. Did that come out of
just a story about
one of the 300 pictures I've taken of myself today. Every girl in the picture is locked into her phone. Every single one is dialed in. Welcome to parenting in 2015. They're all just complete. Oh, hold on, I'd take a selfie with the hot dog, selfie with the churro, selfie just of a selfie. Sitting there in the floor. And nobody noticed. He just collects all the phones. You're not getting it back to the end of the game.
This is one of many videos that we can show about this kind of behavior, this kind of that we're all incredibly involved with our media, but are not loyal again to this kind of media. In another project, I call this the shift in our media culture from living with media that we have somehow some kind of deliberate relationship with, that we can switch on and off, to living in media, like fish in water, where we sort of are immersed in media all the time, in multiple media, and we're sort of like moving across these devices, I would say almost willy-nilly, at least based on very personal preferences. And the question is, how do you make content for this kind of culture? Because it's not getting people to pay attention to you in your newspaper anymore. That really doesn't gel with the way those girls or the way these fish behave in media. You somehow have to sort of move with people, and your story has to be dynamic too. I think this is a theme in my presentation that I'll wrap up very quickly. Is this dynamism, this movement, this sort of fluid, or dare I say liquid type of journalism and type of media environment that we've engaged in. Now, Henry Jenkins, more than 10 years ago, said that what media companies need to do to adapt to this kind of media culture is to adapt to what he called convergence culture. And what does that mean? It means that the culture of media production needs to fuse with the culture of media consumption. Which on the production side means that we have to start thinking about to tell stories that live and move across multiple media simultaneously, and that we need to look at consumers not as people that we shout at and market to, but people that we co-create with, collaborate with. Now, Henry is somebody who came out of the fan media studies kind of background, so he loves fans and fandom, so he considers any media user a fan. That might be overreaching a bit, but still it's interesting to explore. How is journalism all trying at the moment to adapt to this kind of media culture? Because it is. I mean, maybe I'm stereotyping a little bit the legacy newsroom and the newspaper and that kind of stuff, and I mean no disrespect, but what I do mean is that what you do see, that already, at least in pockets of media organizations and outside, you see journalism already trying to explore new ways of storytelling that kind of adapt to this environment. And the challenge to us is, how do we teach this stuff, right? Do we still teach sequences, for example? This is an old debate, or a relevant debate. How do we teach media life or convergence culture in journalistic storytelling, right? I mean, you could start with, well, this one thing means that journalists should be comfortable with multimedia storytelling, right? You have one story, you create that story with many different forms, but you use one channel. And so you create a story that has some video, some audio, some text, some images, and then you put it on a website or in an app or something like that. And then you have one story that involves one channel. And this is something that is celebrated in journalism today. I mean, the examples that we often get are Firestorm or The Guardian that does this very well, or Snowfall in the New York Times a couple of years ago. Really beautifully rendered, moving images, infographics, stories in audio and text, beautiful pieces of multimedia journalism that cost many man-hours to make. Big departments were involved and got many prizes. It's great. In the Netherlands, we have something like that too. This was a story that was done the same way as Firestorm and Guardian, it's about the only time that we achieved anything with soccer, which was in 1988. We became European Championships, and because we now are not even participating, we get these newspapers produce these kind of stories about, remember way back when we still mattered, and they did it in a beautiful multimedia way. We can take it even further, virtual reality. New York Times is exploring with that, with virtual reality stories, or for example, beautiful image galleries that NPR makes in the US. Now, these are, I know, US-centric examples. I'm not meaning to say that in the US they do everything more and better. They absolutely do not. I happen to have these on hand, but I mean, this is happening around the world. The thing, though, is it doesn't match this media culture that I was just talking about, because it still requires people to go to one place and stick around. Sticky content. As a trend watcher recently told me, it used to be sticky content, and to create content that would stick, that people would stick to. That's 20th century. It's now sticky users. How can you stick your content to the user wherever he or she is going? You have to have a story that sort of flows with the user. Wherever the user is, whether the user is in a browser or in a social media platform like Snapchat or Twitter or Kik or something like that, or WeChat, whether he or she is watching TV or browsing through a magazine, on all these places your story sort of has to evolve. So cross-media is an answer to that, right? Where you have one story, you create one story, a new story, Britain voted Brexit, voted to exit the EU, and you will run it across many different channels at the same time. The benchmark case for this is Star Wars. George Lucas invented this way of storytelling. I mean, wherever you encounter Star Wars, it's the same bloody story, right? The Empire is bad, the Jedi are good, and Obi-Wan, and spoiler, I'm sorry. And so when he sold, when he gave other companies permission to use Star Wars in their story, whether it was video games, or board games, or animation, or Trivial Pursuit, whatever he said, you can do anything you want. Of course, I get most of the receipts, but you cannot make Jedi bad. If you do that, lawsuit. You can, as fans, you can download everything from Star Wars, from LucasArts. You can create your own fan videos. All that's great. George Lucas says go. There's amazing Star Wars fan movies out there. But Jedi, good, Empire, bad. You cannot mess with the story. The story is hermetically sealed. So that's the ultimate in cross-media storytelling. The next step would be transmedia storytelling, where there's just a story world. The story world would be, some people in the UK are in favor of being in the EU, and the other people are definitely not in favor. And so one of the stories in that story world is, hey, we just had a referendum, and you know what? The people who are against staying in the EU won. Happened last night. That's just one of many stories. There's all kinds of stories evolving around this, including stories that were generated by people, by everyday users, by consumers, in different forms. It's audio, video, and so you start creating transmedia worlds, or story worlds, within which people then can consume or produce whatever they want. This kind of storytelling I haven't seen yet, but it shouldn't be that hard with the increased integration of media companies and platforms and journalists being increasingly versed in working in teams together rather than being loners. You would imagine that there's a creative potential here. But we haven't seen it yet. There's one, the Matrix is actually the benchmark case here. A series of movies, animation films, an online encyclopedia, debate groups online, video games, books, fan fiction, all of that contributes to a story. I don't know if you've ever seen the three movies back to back. They make no sense whatsoever, and that's because, not just because Lawrence Fishburne has impossible dialogue, welcome to the desert of the real, oh yeah, but it's more that in between the films you should have played the video games, because the video games carry the story from one movie to the next. And that's why in the second film everybody talks about the ship that's somewhere, and you go like, what ship? I didn't do that. What did I zonk out? but no, it's in Enter the Matrix, the video game. So that's transmedia storytelling. Interesting, wait, I've already run out of time. So what I want to leave you with are the media professionals. So finally, so what I'm trying to do on all of these levels is sing the signal of a couple of developments that disturb, disrupt, upend, move through the sort of the traditional discourse of what is journalism, and showing that how that discourse, where it came from, the newsroom, and what is happening now both in and outside of those newsrooms that really disrupt this discussion. And that makes it, I think, fascinating to think about what journalism actually is. Because it's too easy, I think, for us, at least for me, to just say, I teach journalism, I run a journalism program, and then somehow assume that I know, or anybody knows what I'm talking about. Like that it's somehow coherent, that it makes sense in a certain way, which, to me, it clearly doesn't. Maybe it's never did, but today it definitely doesn't. And these are just some of, I think, the most interesting developments that I wanted to signal. But when it comes to media professionals, I'm going to leave this. It was something really awful that came from the US. I would love to talk to you about it later. It's the rebranding of the Tribune Company. Maybe you follow that story, the Tribune Company, Chicago Tribune and everything. They've just been rebranded as Trunk, which stands for Tribune Online Content. And they released a bunch of promo videos where it's just these very happy people talking about journalism like it's sort of like it's vanilla ice cream, and how we're going to sell to this market and that, and this is the best time for journalism ever. And you go, part of me is excited, okay, great, this is a new story. Part of me is go like, what the? Okay, anyway, but what you need, what journalists say in surveys and interviews, of course, that this is an industry where you have to be flexible. You cannot just be a one-trick pony. You can't just bank like I'm going to study journalism and end up in a newspaper and I'll have a job. That just, I don't know. I mean, our master program in the Netherlands is the most successful journalism program in the Netherlands. Not because we're great, but because we're in Amsterdam. All the other ones are way in the outskirts of the country. All the media are in Amsterdam. We are in Amsterdam, so they come to us. That's how it works. And so all our journalists work. This year we celebrated our 15th year in existence. We traced back our alumni, where are they working, and I noticed that after the first 9 years, none of them have jobs anymore. They're all freelancers. And these are the most successful journalists. So flexibility, cross-subsidized work styles, like what we see now in journalism is what we've always seen in Hollywood. Remember, if you go to Hollywood and somebody gives you coffee in Starbucks, that somebody in the evening goes to auditions, right? Somebody who serves you dinner at a restaurant is writing scripts at night. That's a cross-subsidized work style, and that's what you see in journalism. In the Netherlands, 60% of freelance journalists rely on the income of their partner to do journalism. And the Netherlands has a way more stable media market than most other countries in Europe. Very heavily state-subsidized and that kind of stuff. And the same goes for rock bands in the UK. So we see the same kind of work style. And do we talk about that in the classroom? How do you manage when you spend 3 or 4 days a week doing PR, press releases, and 1 or 2 days a week doing investigative reporting? That's an interesting question. What it really comes down to is precarity. And what precarity is, it's not having a job. Precarity is having no control over what happens next. Whether you have a job or not, whether you have a client or not, whether you have an assignment or not. Whether your assignment is awesome, whether your story hits the front page, it doesn't matter, it has no direct bearing on what will happen next to you. That's precarity. And precarity is this total lack of any kind of control over what happens next. And that is what defines both the working lives of people who work for the Guardian and BBC, as well as for the freelancers and the people in the startups or in the local newspapers in the middle of nowhere, or community radio stations and whatnot. Precarity. And I want to leave you with a quote from Zygmunt Bauman, she's probably know, professor here at Leeds University, very inspiring social theorist. The notion of liquid journalism is inspired by his work on liquid life and liquid modernity. And in 2001, he said this: "We are called to believe today that security is disempowering, the security of a full-time job, a career for the rest of your life with one company, that kind of stuff, or the security of a marriage. It's disempowering, disabling, breeding resented dependency, and constraining the human agent's freedom. Right? Flexibility, that's what we're celebrating here. And then what I seem to be celebrating. And what is passed over in silence, he says, that acrobatics and rope walking without a safety net are an art that few people can master and a recipe of disaster for all the rest. I would have loved to throw statistics at you on the levels of stress and burnout among journalists reported in recent studies. It's appalling. And I thought I've already talked way too much. And the answers to all these questions will be. Thank you for